Right, good afternoon and welcome to this workshop or seminar or presentation. It's sometimes difficult to differentiate between these terms. Assumably, workshop is something that you have hands-on activities, but this might not be the case today, so mostly it would be in the form of presentation. This is the second workshop that we are offering on qualitative inquiry, hopefully more in future. In the first workshop, which was presented by Professor Phil Benson on 27th of September, he walked the audience through how to set up an in vivo data file in order to conduct a case study or multiple case study, how to organize data sources, and how to define participants. This workshop is in a sense a follow-up on the previous one, because in that workshop we learned about how to set up a project in vivo. In this workshop I'm mostly focusing on how to codify or how to code qualitative data and do the analysis. But it is a standalone by itself, so those who did not attend the first workshop, this is by itself independent, and hopefully we can learn from this as relates to coding qualitative data and doing qualitative data analysis. The outline of today's presentation is firstly, I will focus on features of qualitative research as a way of introduction, and then we look at what counts as qualitative data. And in the third part, I will focus on coding as a pathway to qualitative data analysis. And fourthly, we will look at qualitative data analysis, and in particular different approaches. So we will be looking at lumping, as it is called, and splitting, or topic and thematic analysis versus code-based analysis. And then three approaches to coding that I will discuss, and finally some tips or strategies or suggestions, especially for HDR students, how to go about choosing from among different approaches and define their coding and analysis of their qualitative data. In addition to exposing you to different approaches to qualitative data analysis and coding, my purpose is to clarify on some key terms and concepts that might be used interchangeably, where there is usually a nuanced difference between these key terms and concepts. So all through the presentation, I will clarify on some of these. Like, for example, we hear from qualitative researchers that what type of analysis you are doing, and they say thematic analysis. And when you ask them to elaborate on that, then what they describe actually is not thematic analysis, is a splitting or code-based type of analysis. So while there are some overlaps, there are certainly differences that we'll find out in today's presentation. Through the presentation, I will refer to some key concepts and terms that you might not be familiar with, and we might not have enough time to explain them. So for those who are interested in, they can refer to the Encyclopedia of Research Methods that I wrote and it was published by Routledge last year, and this is a way of promoting my book in order to learn about those key concepts and key terms. Fortunately, Macquarie Library has got copies, so perhaps there is no need to purchase it, and therefore you can use it from library. All right. What is qualitative approach to research? As we all know, usually researchers frame themselves within a quantitative, positivistic approach to research versus qualitative, interpretive approach to research. Therefore, the key features and characteristics of a qualitative approach to research is that it is interpretive, in the sense that the underlying assumption is that there is no one reality, and as relates to social reality, and there are different interpretations of that, and therefore as researchers we are interested to find out how different people actually interpret and conceive that social reality. So this is why usually it is called interpretive paradigm. And also we look for social construction of these realities. In other words, how different groups of people as a community perhaps conceive and interpret reality, and accordingly they define the world that they live in and the world that they experience. We can say that qualitative research is a collective term and covers a range of different methods, including but not limited to ethnography, which deals with studying ethnic groups and cultural aspects of the world that people live in, case study, discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis, narrative inquiry, grounded theory that we will be wrestling with today in today's presentation, conversation analysis and multimodal analysis and multimodal discourse analysis. As different methods within the paradigm of qualitative research, there are certainly overlaps between these different methods, but there are differences as well. So it is possible, for example, to do a case study with ethnographic orientation, but it is also possible to do a case study which is not necessarily focusing on ethnic groups. In qualitative research, as researchers, we usually seek an insider view of the social world, and therefore one of the features that have been assigned to qualitative research is that it seeks emic perspective as contrasted with ethic perspective, which usually refers to researcher perspectives on research. In other words, broadly speaking, quantitative researchers seeking an ethic perspective. In other words, looking at the social phenomena and the world from the perspective of the researcher, whereas qualitative researchers look at the phenomenon from the perspective of participants. And therefore, they try to narrate, to interpret, to describe, and to analyze the world as seen by participants. The other feature of qualitative research is that it uses an inductive or emergent approach. And again, unlike quantitative research where time is spent reviewing the literature and planning details of all the stages of research process, there is a need to start gathering data and immersing ourselves into data. And then it is the data that lets us know even to decide about research questions. And therefore, everything in qualitative research, if it is a fully fledged qualitative research, is emergent. The research questions, the design, the analysis, and also the findings. Of course, this certainly poses a challenge to HDR students, who are usually required to put in a proposal. And in the proposal, they are required to have not only literature review, but sometimes even theoretical framework. What is your theoretical framework? So that's a real challenge, and it would be interesting to find out how HDR students and qualitative researchers deal with this challenge, and if they want to do a real qualitative approach to their research. The other feature of qualitative research and analysis is that it is fundamentally working intensively with small samples. Again, in contrast to quantitative research that usually researchers work with larger samples, because the purpose is generalization to a target population. In qualitative research, researchers focus on smaller samples to study the phenomenon in depth. Therefore, there is a contrast of breadth and depth as we think about quantitative and qualitative research. In quantitative research, the main purpose is generalization, universal law, generalizing findings of the samples to the target population, whereas in qualitative research, the main purpose is to study a small number, but in depth. Interestingly enough, those who are familiar with quantitative research, because it is also called a normative type of research that works on the basis of normal distribution, when we come across some participants whose performance does not fit with the norm, we put them aside as outliers. Right? So through preliminary statistical analysis, we look for outliers and then we exclude them from analysis. In qualitative research, interestingly enough, the focus is on these outliers, right? And see how they see the world and what their behavior and experience actually tells us about the unique worldview that they have developed. The outcome of qualitative research is usually hypothetical explanation of social phenomena, and if it is a fully fledged type of qualitative research project, then we can aim for developing a theory, and therefore the term grounded theory, a theory that is grounded in data, right? Whereas again, if we are thinking about quantitative research, mostly it is testing hypotheses and testing theories. So this is another distinction between quantitative and qualitative research, that is usually said that in quantitative research we want to test a hypothesis, whereas in qualitative research we generate hypothesis, and if they are well done, and if we have enough data and we have adequate analysis, then it is possible even to develop a theory. So what counts as qualitative data? These are some of the sources of data that qualitative researchers use in their research. Interviews, including individual and focus group. As you might be familiar, individual-based interviews, we have one-on-one talks, interviews, chats with participants, whereas focus group, we have a group of participants who discuss a topic. And we as researcher or the person in charge of collecting data usually acts as a moderator, as a mediator, in order to help the participants express their views. Semi-structured, in that usually we have some core questions, but we probe for further elaboration on the part of participants. So especially this is useful when we have different participants, and therefore we want to opt for some levels of consistency, and therefore some core questions are used, but certainly the interviewer will be able to probe and ask further questions from the participants in order to elaborate on their responses. However, in some qualitative research methods like ethnography, for example, researchers are much interested in open and unstructured interviews or chats or conversations that usually take place in very comfortable places. And the participant may talk for 1 hour without any interruption. And so all these life stories and reflections get recorded based on consent information, that has been provided by the participants. The other source of data in qualitative research are memos. These are reflections written by the researcher on cases and data produced by them. Memos are very useful, and so during interviews we may take memos in order to reflect on the participants, on the context, on some key concepts that might arise as we talk with the participants. Another source of data in qualitative research are field notes, which are like memos, but are more likely to be written around particular incidents or observations or topics, making coding more straightforward. Coding of field notes is likely to be more descriptive than coding of interview data, because in field notes, as it is indicated, actually, we just focus on some particular incidents in the field observation when we are busy with observing the cases in the field. Short responses to open-ended questions is another data source that could be used in qualitative research. And since they are short responses, therefore, there is the possibility of auto-coding. If you are using in vivo, then it is possible to use auto-coding, because that does not need much rigorous coding, as we will be discussing today. Streaming data, including audio and video from participants, but certainly they are much more difficult to code as they are, unless, and in majority of the cases, researchers prefer to transcribe them. So if, for example, you have recorded a teacher in action in classroom using audio or video recorders, it is possible, of course, to upload these types of data in vivo, because new versions of in vivo have the capability of receiving these type of data sources. But for the sake of coding, some researchers prefer to transcribe them and then upload the transcription of these audio and video footings. Observations of all types, like classroom observation and field observation and observing participants in action, is another source for qualitative data. When it is classroom-based observation, then we might assume the role of participant observer versus non-participant observer. This is also true when it comes to ethnographic type of qualitative research. The difference is that if we assume a participant observer, then we would be like any other participant, and we participate in all the activities, let it be classroom activities or any type of cultural activities that take place in the field. Drawings, pictures, and other visual data are also source of data. As you notice in the previous workshop, Professor Benson showed some drawings made by participants who are multilingual participants in Blacktown, for example, as they asked them to draw what they understand from themselves in the form of pictures. Think aloud protocols are another source of qualitative data, although some researchers believe that these are more cognitively oriented and cognitively based, and might lend themselves to more quantitative type of data analysis, especially in terms of frequency and percentage of particular codes and concepts, but still they could be used as qualitative data source, and therefore different types like concurrent think aloud protocols, summary recalls, stimulated recalls, and retrospective interviews are useful data sources that could be used in qualitative research. So once we have collected data from any of these qualitative data sources or a combination of them, what would be the process for analyzing these qualitative data sources? This is from Miles, Huberman, and Saldana, and they suggest that what we do in qualitative data analysis is that we assign codes or TIMs to a set of interview transcripts, field notes, or documents, or any other type of qualitative data that we have collected. So they start with coding. The second stage in the process of qualitative data analysis is sorting and sifting through these coded materials to identify similar phrases, relationships between variables, patterns, themes, categories, and to identify distinct differences between subgroups and common sequences. Once these two first levels are done, then researchers usually isolate the patterns and processes and commonalities and differences, and taking them out of the field in the next wave of data collection, because these would be very good triggers and prompts for next round of data collection. At this stage, we usually come up with some understandings, with some hypothetical explanations, but in need of further elaboration and confirmation of hypothetical explanation, and therefore these provide us very good prompts in order to re-enter into the field and complete data collection. And gradually elaborating a small set of assertions, propositions, and generalizations that cover the consistencies discerned in the databases. So gradually from more concrete type of data towards more abstract level of hypothetical explanation, and comparing these generalizations with a formalized body of knowledge in the form of constructs or theories, and therefore developing theory out of qualitative data. Please be advised that this is one framework suggested by Miles, Huberman, and Saldana, and certainly other qualitative researchers and experts might have other alternatives for the process of data analysis. I have brought this because I thought this will fit with some of the points that I'm going to discuss in today's workshop. So based on this process suggested by Miles and his colleagues, then we can think of analytic methods of qualitative data analysis at three levels. The first level certainly is induction, immersing ourselves into data, knowing about data, letting the data speak out, and trying to understand the data and what the participants are discussing as relates to different issues. So it is at this stage that we assign codes. So the bolded terms are borrowed from Miles, Huberman, and Saldana. So assigning codes to a set of interview transcripts, field notes, or documents. So this level of analysis is usually referred to as induction, immersing ourselves into data and trying to codify or assign codes to certain segments and parts of the data. The second level of analysis could be considered as or defined as deduction, which includes sorting and isolating patterns. Once we assign codes to different segments of the data, then at the second level, we try to bring similar things together. And once we have a collection of similar items, distinguish them from another set of similar items. So bringing similar things together and differentiating different collections or categories from each other. And once we have these categories, then we will be looking for relationship between these categories and how they might help us in order to develop a more general explanation about the phenomenon under study. Once we are there, according to the framework suggested by Miles Huberman and Saldana, there is another stage of verification or validation. And we will find out when I talk about grounded theory that these two levels, deduction, verification, and validation, is also supported and advocated by Strauss, one of the founders of grounded theory, but it is not supported by Glaser, who was another founder of grounded theory. And this is where Glaser and Strauss actually diverge from each other and represent different approaches to grounded theory. But in any case, we can think of qualitative data analysis from this perspective and this analytical framework as three distinct stages of induction, deduction, validation, or verification. The other way of looking at qualitative data analysis is thinking about lumping and splitting, or I have used the metaphor of skimming and scanning as relates to reading. When teaching readers, we teach them skimming and scanning. Skimming means looking for the gist, looking for general ideas. And usually in tests of reading comprehension, there are items that ask test takers to identify main ideas. What was the main idea? So usually test takers are instructed not to read everything in the text. Just look at the topic sentences or concluding sentences in order to get an idea of what the text is all about, to learn the gist of the matter. And therefore, with a skimming, it would be possible to say what the whole text is about. So lumping a strategy or approach or method to qualitative data analysis is more or less like a skimming through the data. This means that as analysts, we are not focusing on specific things. Rather, we are looking for more general ideas, topics, themes. And this way of analyzing qualitative data is usually referred to as thematic analysis. And this is where I will be differentiating between thematic analysis and more detailed coding of the qualitative analysis, which we refer to as a splitting out the text or data sources into smaller units and looking for more details, and therefore the metaphor of scanning, looking for particular pieces of information that could be codified. So data can be lumped together with a single code, and this single code will represent a topic or a theme, or can be split into many smaller parts, each bearing its own code. So you can visualize or imagine that if we have a paragraph, for example, then we might assign it one general code and consider it as a theme, or we might break it down into 3 segments and sections and assign 3 different codes, which are more detailed. And splitting, the data. Obviously, splitting is time consuming because it takes more time to read line by line, sometimes phrase by phrase, word by word. But it may produce a more nuanced analysis. Lumping gets to the essence of thematic categorization, although it may produce superficial analysis, as Pat Baisley thinks it might be the case. In lumping, themes or patterns are explored and extracted from the data. They describe and organize the possible observations and interpretation of the phenomena as Boyetsis contends. So, through thematic analysis or lumping or more general approach to data analysis, you search for themes that emerge as being important to the description, explanation of the phenomenon. The process, therefore, involves identification of themes through careful reading and rereading of the data, and it's a form of pattern recognition from the data, like some of those. I don't know what it is called actually, that you need to carefully look, and then an image actually emerges from the background. So it's pattern recognition from the data. If you want to have a visual representation of lumping or thematic analysis, then this is the way that it can be visualized. As you can see, we can think of basic themes that go together and form an organizing theme. Another set of basic themes that go together and form another organizing theme. Another set of basic themes that go together and form an organizing theme, and so on and so forth. And finally, these organizing themes can be brought together and produce a global theme. Of course, and in a sense, thematic analysis might not be that different from code-based analysis, in the sense that we can think of any of these basic themes as a code. However, it is the nature of the codes that are different in thematic analysis versus code-based analysis. In thematic analysis, codes are more general, as we mentioned, and therefore they include larger segments of the data source because there is no intention for focusing on details. In code-based analysis, any of these themes would be much more subtle and include therefore nuanced pieces of information. And as we can, and as it was said actually in previous slides, code-based analysis is much more time-consuming, but it could result in a more accurate type of analysis. So it depends on your preference, whether you are a more holistic person or a more atomistic person, whether you have more time to devote to your analysis, or whether you are constrained by time frame and therefore you just need to produce some organizing themes and then bring things together. And also it might relate to some other factors that at the time of deciding about data analysis you can think about and decide whether you want to go with a thematic analysis, or you would like and prefer to have a more code-based type of analysis. So what is the feature of a code-based type of data analysis? We have codes, coding, we have categories or categorizing, and then we have themes. So we can see that there are at least 2 preliminary steps before coming to themes, and these needs to be defined by codes and categories. So 2 other levels have been added and included in code-based analysis. We start with more accurate and specific codes. Then we bring codes together in order to form a category, and then we bring categories together in order to form a theme. Again, if you want to have a visual representation of a code-based approach to qualitative data analysis, this is the way that we can think about it. You can see that at this level we have codes, more specific pieces of information, and these codes are concrete in the sense that they are data-based. So for any code, actually, we have a substance, we have a representation in the data. These codes or numbers of codes can go together in order to form a subcategory, and subcategories can go together to form a category, and categories can go together in order to produce a theme. So you can compare this with thematic analysis, and you can see and assume that there are some more careful and accurate levels before we get to the themes. And usually this is the procedure that is recommended for HDR students to follow a code-based type of analysis. In a sense, it might be more straightforward because in thematic analysis, perhaps more experienced qualitative researchers might be able to do that. By just looking at the data, they might be able to assign some topics and themes, whereas for less experienced researchers, they might need to work with data, exact data, and concrete pieces of data, and gradually move up in order to form their categories, and finally finding relationship between categories and therefore developing themes. So if we follow a code-based approach to qualitative data analysis, then certainly we need a coding scheme. And this is something that you will be asked if you submit a paper to a journal, or if you submit your thesis for examination, where is your coding scheme? And usually it comes as an appendix of the thesis. This is where readers and examiners would like to look at and see how you have defined your codes, your subcategories, your categories, and how they are related to each other, and how they can lead to extracting a theme or themes from your data. As a way of defining coding scheme, therefore, it is a well-structured system that provides a solid basis of concepts and categories to work with, and serves as an effective management tool to facilitate data analysis, especially and some of qualitative researchers believe that computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software programs like NVivo are based on code-based rather than thematic analysis. And so if you are using NVivo or similar qualitative data software, then it is possible to define your coding scheme as nodes, and then use it easily when you are coding your data. And the coding scheme enables you to interrogate the data and to see how different things might be related to each other. And this is a positive point and an advantage, because in the past, actually, when this was done manually, it was very difficult to be able to bring things together, whereas nowadays, using computer-assisted programs, it is possible to ask for all the codes, all the subcategories and categories as they go together, and therefore see how they might be related to each other. So if we want to think about a coding scheme, then it is the reversed version of the code-based analysis in the previous slides. So basically, what people will be looking for in your coding scheme is to look at your categories, how you have defined your categories, how any of these categories might be divided in some other subcategories, and how each subcategory might include some more specific and concrete codes. And this way there is a hierarchical relationship between codes, subcategories, categories, and finally themes, right? And this should be dynamic and representative and meaningful as relates to data analysis and the data sets that we have. Okay. So coding actually is the pathway to qualitative data analysis, and it is the core of the analytic process when collecting and analyzing qualitative data, and therefore it is necessary to gain meaningful results that can be supported by the data. Any conclusions, inferences made from the data should be supported or should be potentially capable of being supported by data through the hierarchy that we discussed before. And it involves seeing and interpreting what has been said, written, or done, reflecting and evolving categories. Yes, one important point is that data analysis in qualitative research is iterative, is recursive. Again, contrary to quantitative analysis, that it is very structured and linear. We go from A to B to C to D and to E. In qualitative research, actually, we get back to previous stages, and therefore no category or subcategory or theme is finalized until we have enough data to support, and until we get back to the field and collect further data and do further analysis, and therefore there is room for revision. And again, this is another aspect of emergence or emerging nature of qualitative data analysis. Chalmers, who is one of the developers of a newer form of grounded theory, describes coding as the pivotal link between data collection and explaining the meaning of the data, and therefore a code is considered as a descriptive construct designed by the researcher to capture the primary content or essence of the data. And we need to remember, as Saldana has mentioned, that coding is not only labeling, as it might be perceived initially. It's also linking different pieces of data to each other, because when we go through an entire interview and we code different segments and sections in different parts of the interview to one code, we are telling ourselves that all these are related to each other. And even when we go through different data sources and we code with the same code, again, we are saying that this segment in the interview is related to this segment in observation, is related to this segment in field notes, and is related to this segment in another data source. Right. There are different ways of coding qualitative data, but we need to remember that as the whole qualitative research is interpretive, coding is also interpretive, meaning that I might code something as a label, as a meaning, as a concept. You might code it differently with another label, and therefore it would be interesting to have a colleague, a friend, another coder, to see how they code different segments, and then the discussion also would be very useful. And be advised that any step in the process of qualitative data analysis needs to be documented and is part of the analysis, and therefore in case we are discussing our coding with another person and whether we agree or disagree, and the outcome of the discussion is very useful as part of the process of qualitative data analysis. I take this opportunity and draw your attention to intercoder reliability, again, which is another challenge, especially to HDR students. And it all depends, again, on the perspective that we bring to qualitative research and qualitative data analysis. Some qualitative researchers believe that there is no need for intercoder reliability, consensus agreement, because not only participants see the world differently, but also researchers see the world differently. And therefore, my account of a social phenomenon is the way that I interpret and perceive my participants' perception of their lived experience. If you look at the data, you will have your own account of the participants' perception of their lived experience. So this group of qualitative researchers believe that any qualitative data analysis is unique, and therefore this is one of the advantages of the paradigm of interpretivism and multiple realities. On the contrary, there are some qualitative researchers that they stick to the rigid and a structured way of qualitative data analysis, and they seek intercoder reliability, and they look for consistency between coders and researchers. And therefore, in consultation with your supervisors, you might need to find out whether it's to your benefit of having intercoder reliability done and reported in your thesis, or whether it's better to leave it out. And all this depends on who your examiners would be. So because usually your supervisors know who the examiners would be, and they are aware of what type of qualitative researchers they are, they will be in a position to advise whether this is something needed or not. All right, now let's have a look at 3 approaches to coding qualitative data, which is the core of today's presentation. I have named them as inductive, deductive, and abductive, right? Inductive, as we can assume, is bottom-up, data-driven, and we can also name it as Gleiserian. I told you that Gleiser and Strauss developed grounded theory 50 years ago, and they were working together, but gradually they diverged in the way that they perceived and conceptualized data analysis in grounded theory. Therefore, inductive approach to coding and data analysis could be considered as Gleiserian, the way that I will explain it. Deductive or top-down or theory-driven is usually said to be based on Chicago School of Sociology, and therefore it can be named after them. And if you are looking for a person, Gilgan, who is a sociologist, and we'll see her in the presentation, I mean her name. And so these types of qualitative researchers advocate a top-down approach to coding and analyzing qualitative data. Abductive or data and theory driven, which is a combination of inductive and deductive, could be characterized or featured as Straussian, as we might call it. Again, I take this opportunity and assure you that you can have your style of coding as far as you will be able to justify it and articulate it and explain it to others. So what I'm presenting today should be used as guidelines. Ultimately, you might or you might not abide to any of these and prefer to have your own way of coding and data analysis, but certainly these are useful as they are able to provide us with some guidelines. So, because I said that inductive is Glacierian and abductive is Straussian, so it would be useful to look at two versions of grounded theory. And although initially there was one version of grounded theory, but over time Glacier and Strauss developed their own versions of grounded theory. From Glacier's perspective, which is also called classical grounded theory. It is called classical grounded theory because it is said that Glacier is committed to the original version and therefore considers a Strauss version as a divergent one. From classical grounded theory, the generation of hypotheses that can is the main issue. The development of hypothetical explanation or developing the theory is the main issue. So, if you remember, deduction and verification is not considered as part of the grounded theory. In other words, the role of grounded theory in qualitative data analysis is assumed as generating theory. Testing it, validating it is another story that could be done in other qualitative or quantitative research studies. From a Strauss perspective, an empirically grounded theory is both generated and verified in the data, and therefore Strauss considers both the generation and verification of the theory as part of the grounded theory. This therefore leads us to think about the role of literature or the role of theory in qualitative research. From a Glacierian perspective, literature and theory should not be involved in research until the last stages of qualitative data analysis. Once the themes are developed, the theoretical explanation is developed, and at that stage it is possible to consult literature and other theories and make comparisons, how they might be compared or how they might be different. Whereas Strauss believes that literature and theory could be very useful all through the process for developing categories and hypothetical explanations and to verify and validate the categories as well as the theories developed. So we can see the difference that relates also to the role of theory and literature in qualitative research. So classical grounded theory methodologists are cautious about the use of prior theory and warn about the imposition of theory on findings and advocate that researchers allow theory to emerge from the analysis. So any discussion of theory should be that emerges from the data and analysis and not beyond the data. Right. As relates to classical grounded theory, there are two types of coding. One is substantive, which we can also refer to as open coding, and the other one is theoretical, that could also be called selective. But all is based on data, and all is data is a well-known Glacierian dictum. All data, nothing beyond data, right? So there are two stages from the classical grounded theory perspective: substantive coding and theoretical coding. And the concept and the term constant comparison analysis is used both by Glacier and by Strauss, but with different interpretations. Okay? For Glacier, the constant comparison allows the core category to emerge, and unlike Glacerian version, it is the core that then becomes the focus of the literature review. So until these core categories and themes are developed, literature and theory is not brought in to qualitative data analysis. There are two concepts related to classical grounded theory. One is theoretical sampling, and the other one is data saturation. And we will see that, again, this is different from Strauss' version of grounded theory. From classical grounded theory, it is argued that once you collect data, you start analysis, and you develop your categories, and you come up with questions. You get back to the field, and you collect further data, this time with more focused questions. And again, you analyze it, and you try to amend and complete your categories, producing more meaningful categories. Again, you come up with further questions, and you get back to field, and you collect further data, and you do further analysis. This iteration and cycling between data and analysis continues until you get to saturation. Saturation means that the new data does not have anything new to offer. So once you get to that stage, then this means data saturation, and there is no need for further data collection, and therefore everything is now matured and ready to present. So from a classical grounded theory perspective, the analytical procedure could be visualized or represented in this way: starting with the data, doing substantive coding, developing theoretical coding or theoretical explanations, and then going for theoretical sampling, collecting further data based on the questions that arise from theoretical coding. And once we get to data saturation, then it is possible to put forth and propose a grounded theory, a theory which is grounded in the data. As you can see, actually, there is no sign of external theory or literature that could help this process. Of course, as I mentioned before, it is at this stage that classical grounded theory researchers are allowed to consult theory and make comparisons between the theory that they developed and the existent theoretical frameworks. Okay. The next approach to coding qualitative data is deductive approach or top-down coding. Deductive coding has also been named as template approach because we bring a template to coding the data, and is based on analytic induction, which was the core concept in Chicago School of Sociology. And it is said that analytic induction involves the use of theory, often loosely defined. By loosely defined, we mean that any previously conducted research and inferences made by previous researchers could be considered as a theoretical framework or a theory by itself in the conduct of research and the processes that involve in the coding and analyzing qualitative data. In deductive coding, researchers begin with a theoretical framework, more or less similar to quantitative research, that theory informs the whole process of research. And this theoretical framework can guide the process of codification as well as data analysis. And even the theoretical framework and the concepts become the source for initial codes that can be thought as sensitizing concepts. In other words, the available theoretical concepts could be used as sensitizing concepts. In other words, as soon as we come across similar concepts in the data, it triggers, it rings the bell that yes, this is that, and therefore I can code it with that concept. Gilgan, as I mentioned before, coined the term deductive qualitative analysis, which is an update of analytic induction, which was an early approach to qualitative research associated with the Chicago School of Sociology. So in deductive coding, you use an available framework, but also you are allowed to code that segments or part of data that do not lend themselves to available categories or concepts. So because qualitative research is flexible, still you have this flexibility to use a more general category as others, for example, and put everything else in that to look at and see how it might add to the previous categories. Or you might use your own categories and therefore name them. The advantage of using these extra categories is that you will be in a position to modify the current theoretical framework. And you can say that although this theoretical framework was used, but based on our data and analysis, we came across these two further categories, and therefore the initial and original theoretical framework could be modified in this or that way. The other strategy in doing deductive coding, because one of the challenges confronting deductive coding is that researchers might just look for confirming available theoretical frameworks with their data, and therefore as a way out is that we can do negative or deviant case analysis. This is another term that is used in qualitative research, whether we are using inductive or deductive approach. A negative case analysis or deviant case analysis will help us to look for counter argument. So once we have developed our categories, we will be looking for if there are any counter evidence from other participants, and then it is possible to codify the data and provide deviant evidence for the ones that have been produced. Let me give you some examples of some theoretical frameworks that could be used in coding qualitative data. Suppose that your topic and your research topic is related to motivation, and you're collecting interviews or self-reports from participants, and then you want to codify and analyze the qualitative data. So at this stage, if you are going to use a deductive approach, it's possible to use one framework, which is developed by Desai and Ryan, and under the self-determination theory of motivation. And their self-determination theory has three categories: intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and amotivation. So as you are reading through interviews or other documents from your participants who have talked about their motivational tendencies, as soon as you come across a piece of information that talks about intrinsic motivation, you code it under intrinsic. As soon as you come across a piece of information that talks about extrinsic motivation, you code it as motivation. Where they say that it doesn't matter, it does not make any changes in my life, whether I study and learn English or university degree or not, then it would be coded as amotivation. So this is one example of a theoretical framework that could be used to code data that is related to motivation. The other example of a theoretical framework you might be familiar with is O'Malley and Chamot learning strategies. So if your research topic is related to learning strategies and you have interviewed some participants, you have asked them to explain to you what learning strategies they use in their degree programs, for example, then you might be able to use cognitive strategies, metacognitive strategies, social strategies, affective strategies as the categories that can help you to codify your data. So as soon as somebody is talking that when I talk to my friends I learn a lot, then this will be coded as a social strategy, and then all those segments of data coded under social strategy could be put under social strategies. The other example of theoretical framework is Park and Oliver pedagogical content conceptual model. So if you are working with teachers and you are interested to find out how teachers develop their pedagogical knowledge, they transform theoretical knowledge into something that could be taught in their classes, then again collecting data through interviews, classroom observations, and any other data sources, these categories might be helpful when they talk about, or in any instance of observation and interviews in that teachers talk about curriculum, then could be coded as knowledge of curriculum, for example. Whenever and wherever they say something that relates to students, so it could be coded as knowledge of students, and so on and so forth in this framework and category. The third approach to qualitative data analysis and coding, as we indicated before, can be characterized and featured as abductive coding. Abductive coding is also referred to as hybrid, and again is based on constant comparison analysis, but another version of constant comparison analysis. Here, constant comparison analysis is a moving back and forth between data collection and data analysis, and between concepts and their indicators, or between theory and data. And there is a quote from Dewey, John Dewey, that calls this type of movement between data and theory as complete thinking, which involves both induction and deduction. So, as I mentioned before, abductive coding could be characterized as Straussian grounded theory, and again, while both the classical grounded theory and Straussian consider a role for literature and theory, as I discussed, the position of theory and literature is totally different. In abductive coding, theory is present from the beginning in the form of guiding the research, the coding process, and using available theoretical frameworks and categories in order to code data. From this perspective and using abductive coding, Strauss and Corbin have developed a more structured coding procedure that includes 3 levels compared to 2 levels of coding suggested by Glaser, as you remember. They have included a medium level, which is axial. So the first and the third one are similar to those of Glaser, but they have added the second one, including categories. So they have initial, axial, and selective, or open, categorical, and theoretical. And as I mentioned before, they believe that current theories and theoretical frameworks can be used to help coding at all these three levels, from the basic concepts up to the categories and finally theoretical levels. So again, if you want to visualize, this is the way that coding and analysis from a Gleicherian grounded theory can be imagined, starting with codes and bringing codes together to form subcategories and bringing subcategories to form categories, and then looking for relationship and interaction between different categories in order to discern hypothetical explanations. So at the level of hypothetical explanation, then we are thinking about general themes that could be extracted from the data. And this is the way that we can think about the position of the three levels of coding. So initial would be concrete with the data. As we move up and develop subcategories and categories, we move towards axial coding, and at a higher level we are moving to selective and more theoretical level of coding and developing hypothetical explanation about the social phenomena. Axial coding is unique to Strauss and Corbin as an addition to Strauss and Corbin as an addition to the classical grounded theory, and is defined as a set of procedures whereby data are put together in new ways after open coding by making connections between different categories. And this is usually done by a paradigm that involves conditions, context, action, interaction, strategies, and consequences. And these are the predetermined categories that could be applied to the coding as Strauss and Corbin suggests. So in abductive coding, we can think of constant comparative analysis as an interaction between induction, deduction with the result of verification or validation. In Gleicherian version of grounded theory, these parts are either absent or very weak. There is no emphasis actually on that. In Strauss and Corbin, they are vivid and present, and what they suggest is that at any level it is possible to move back and forth, not only between what researchers can extract from the data and looking back to the data, but also by looking at the available theoretical frameworks and see how they match or differ with each other for the sake of verification of the categories and theoretical explanations that are developed. So from their perspective, researchers have induction from data, reflection on prior knowledge, theories, and verification in light of both data and prior knowledge. There were severe criticism, especially from Gleiser, on the way that Strauss and Corbin conceptualized grounded theory, and therefore these authors changed verification with validation in order to reduce the level of criticism that they received from other qualitative researchers, and in particular from Gleiser. The way that Gleiser and Corbin have looked at coding and data analysis is shared by other qualitative researchers. So again, I refer to Miles and Huberman, that also suggests starting from a theoretically and empirically derived list while maintaining flexibility in adding, deleting, and reshuffling the codes based on your data. So Strauss and Corbin are not allowed for abductive use of coding and analysis. Miles and Huberman also as two figures, and as those who have contributed to qualitative data analysis. They advocate using prior theoretical frameworks, but with the flexibility of adding, deleting, categories, and therefore developing what is already available in the literature. So if you want to put in a table, Strauss versus Glaser and implications for coding, and looking at the middle column, initial coding concepts, intermediate coding categories, final coding development of propositions. When we look at Strauss and Corbin, we have three distinct levels of coding, including open coding or initial coding, axial coding or categorizing codes together, and finally selective coding, and all in light of prior theory and theoretical frameworks. But if you look at Glaser, actually it's only the first and the third, substantive coding, which is data dependent, and theoretical coding, which is integrating codes in order to develop the theoretical explanation, is still from the data, and only for the sake of comparison and further discussion, comparing with literature and available theories. Okay, as I mentioned, there are quite good criticism of two Glaserian grounded theory that if you are interested in, you can have a look at. But it would be interesting to note that those who criticize Glaserian approach to grounded theory, they say that Strauss and Corbin put more emphasis on deduction and verification, and often leading the researcher away from the data into following prior research and knowledge, which reduces the effectiveness of research. And this might make sense, especially if we put it in a historical context, because historically grounded theory started to criticize quantitative research that gave the main role to theory, and the main purpose and mandate of research as testing theory and testing hypothesis related to theory. So it might make sense within that historical perspective. I've provided some examples of studies with a hybrid coding approach or abductive approach to coding that we can use as models, as good examples of how qualitative researchers might use hybrid type of coding. One is done in 2006 on demonstrating rigor using thematic analysis, a hybrid approach of inductive and deductive coding and theme development, and you can see that the exact word of hybrid and inductive and deductive is even present in the title of the article. It is published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. The other one is published in 2014, To Code or Not to Code, Dilemmas in Analyzing Think Aloud Protocols in Learning Strategies Research, published in the Journal of System, that might be more related to those who are interested in learning strategies and see how it is possible to use a hybrid an abductive approach towards coding and analyzing qualitative data. Right. At the end of this presentation, I would like to have some tips or strategies for how to approach coding and analyzing qualitative data. As I indicated, you can use the discussion that I had today as a guideline. But you might find Miles and Huberman's, Saldana, and Baisley's pragmatic realist position useful. These researchers define themselves as pragmatic realist. When they are asked how would you position yourself in terms of paradigms, they say that we are pragmatic realist. And as such, they recommend that we do not adhere slavishly to one school of thought or practice solely within the boundaries of one particular philosophical approach, because this might not work with the data and the procedure that we want to follow in the analysis. Again, as I indicated early in this presentation, you may develop your own style of coding, but using these as guidelines. But certainly you need to articulate and justify your own procedure and how it might be similar or different from the available coding and analysis procedures. Again, you can think about lumpers versus splitters. Thinking of broad brush versus fine brush, you have certainly see some painters, artists that some prefer actually to have very broad brush. Some others are more interested to have fine tunes and work with details. Decide on your approach to coding. It might be inductive, it might be deductive, or it might be abductive, or any other approach, but you need to justify that in light of the purpose of your research questions, and your data sources. Some research purposes, research questions, data sources might lend themselves to one of these three approaches or methods. Some others might not, might need a novel type of coding and analysis that you can use and get credit for that. But remember that some qualitative research projects are already hypothesis driven. The way that you ask the question, and this is where again your supervisors actually would be helpful. The way that you pose your questions, research questions, imply that you have already got some assumptions about what you're looking for in your data. And so if that's the case, then deductive and abductive approach might be more appropriate than a pure emergent design that you need to collect your data in order to be able to develop your research questions and decide where you want to get to. Whether you use any of these three approaches or you have your own, you need to develop a code book, and this code book is very useful and necessary, not only for providing it as an appendix at the end of your thesis or article, but also as a guideline. And usually these code books have 3 columns. In the first column, we usually have the name of the code. In the second column, we have a brief definition of what the code is. And in the third column, we can have an example of the data from the data sources that we have. It would be useful because usually if we have the code book in front of us, somewhere around us, then we can refer it to it at different times, because especially, and it's my experience, when we have got different data sources and a lot of data, we might get confused as what is what and which code I use for this type of information. It's also important to add some criteria for inclusion and exclusion for codes. So although there is nothing wrong if we code different segments with one code, in other words, to have overlaps in coding of the data, but it would be useful if we have some criteria as how this category, cognitive strategies, would be different from metacognitive strategies, would be different from social strategies. So these inclusion and exclusion criteria will help us to better code the data and do not get confused, and once we get output from computer program, things do not get messed, and see that there are blurred areas that we cannot get our ways through. Another important point is that you need to document the changes to your code book and provide a full account of your coding approach. Again, this is my own personal experience, that I have started with a coding scheme but have ended with a totally different coding scheme all through the path and the process. And this has occurred because of my working with the data, because of my reading, because of my talking to other people, because of doing some preliminary analysis. So it's very useful, and it's even necessary to document the changes that we make to our coding scheme. If you are using computer programs, it would be very helpful, and it would be very straightforward to include these in the memo writing. So you can have your first draft of coding scheme with date and your explanation. You can have your second version of the coding scheme with the explanation and how it was developed, and you can have and all these will help you when you are getting to the level of making meaning out of your data and documenting the process. Again, I did not refer to the term reflexivity, which is another concept in qualitative research, and it is something that is usually required from researchers, because researchers are instruments in qualitative research, and therefore they need to clarify to what extent they influenced the whole process of research, data collection and data analysis. And one way is reflexivity, or providing explanation about your position and your perspectives and your intervention at different stages of the qualitative research. And so again, this is part of the documentation as you work with your data and you are writing your memos. Think about your assumptions, your purpose, research questions, and see which coding approach might be more reasonable. As human beings, we have some preferences, we have some assumptions, we go with some ideas, not the other ones, we prefer some procedures, not the other ones. So all are related to the final choices that we make with the method of coding and analysis that we would like to choose and use in our research. If using abductive, make a balance between induction and deduction, as you noticed, and mix the two approaches carefully, because you need to be aware that they might violate philosophical underpinnings of readers, examiners, right? So again, depending on who will be reading your article or your thesis, they might come at odds with what you are saying and explaining, and therefore they might say that no, I don't agree with this, or this is violating the principle of classical grounded theory. So it would be very useful to clearly explain where are you coming from and how you are approaching your data and analysis, and how it relates to already available paradigms and perspectives. It will help your readers and your examiners not to be harsh, and find who you are and what you are doing and why you are doing what you do. Okay. And yes, I've provided references in case you want to know more about these materials. And as the first workshop, I will provide a link of today's presentation, so you will have access to the slides as well as to the references, and hopefully they help you or give you some tips, as I meant at the end of the presentation, when designing your qualitative research projects. And I would like to conduct one of these types of studies. We have got good time for questions and answers and comments if you have. So I appreciate it if you have your own reflections and questions and comments. I will learn from your own perspectives as well. Yeah. And thank you for a second. No, thank you very much. Yes, please.
Your comments towards the end about documenting categories or codes carefully goes towards replicability, and that, to me anyway, and that goes towards sort of reliability and sort of being the kind of thing, because it always seems to me that the bottom line with adopting a scientific approach to investigation is that it is replicable. And someone else can come along, you tell them what you've done, and they can replicate your results on your data, let's say. So it seems that, you kind of earlier on mentioned that it might be a matter for the supervisor to say whether that was checked on reliability or inter-observer agreement or intercoder agreement. It's kind of optional, but it seems to me if it's going to be replicable, then that kind of needs to be checked. We can't take it for granted. It might be that someone could articulate a code, or wonderfully, and say, yeah, gosh, that sounds good. And then when you actually try and apply it yourself, you find that this is such an idiosyncratic definition that you couldn't possibly. You're at sea when you're actually looking at the data. So I just wondered if you...
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, and that's a very good question. Again, another concept, replicability. To what extent what we do is replicable by other researchers, and they might actually come across the same results if they do it. Of course, again, this is one of the gray areas. Because, again, replicability is a term that initially was coined in quantitative research, and mostly in psychology, that we can make generalizations, and after we have done enough number of studies that we can claim for the replicability of the studies and therefore the generalizations. But you are right, I have seen it in the qualitative literature as well, that if coding and analysis is very peculiar and individual based, that becomes very idiosyncratic, then it would be very hard for other people even to understand and digest. And therefore there should be some room for the replicability, and in a sense and transferability in another sense, which is the equivalent for generalizability. What I have noticed in the literature is that researchers say that it's not the outcome of the qualitative research that needs to be replicable or to be generalized. It is the process that we should be able to transfer to other situations and studies. So one way of looking at it, then, it would be certainly through interaction with other members of the discourse community. If I'm doing a research on a topic, certainly within one department, within a group of researchers, it would be a good idea to have an interaction with them, to explain to them and to have their feedback. And this will help to modify what I initially devised as a code, and finally I got to a stage that could be understood by other like-minded people, at least those who are doing research in this area. So again, I take your recommendation as a valid one, that again, it would be a good idea to talk to supervisors, to colleagues, to co-researchers, to other members of the discourse community, and to discuss some of these issues, and again, documenting how we have come across these codes, if we are not going to do inter-coded reliability as might be needed in some contexts. At least we have some evidence that this is not too idiosyncratic, and this is what other people actually might endorse and respect.
I'm just thinking at the bottom level, you were saying that qualitative analysis can be seen as an interaction between a researcher and data. You could say, well, we don't insist that it be replicable across other people, by other people, but at least the person doing it could replicate it. And I know that gets into difficult areas, so we'll do it again, and do you, do you end up with the same thing, the same codes? You know? Exactly,
yeah. And again, this refers to intra-coded reliability, whether as a person even, we are consistent in what we are saying and doing. Again, I can see actually from the literature that there are some rooms for flexibility, and this is why we change from today's coding to tomorrow's coding to the next coding. Nothing is final and fixed in qualitative research, so any explanation is a version of and might change. Yes, please.
You mentioned that one of the challenges facing researchers doing deductive research is that they become selective sometimes in looking for evidence with data that support their arguments.
Right.
Now, you mentioned one of the ways to deal with this is to look for counter-arguments, counter-evidence.
Yes.
Is there anything else? Could you just elaborate on that? Because that's
yes. There are two strategies that we can use not to constrain our analysis by just confirming prior categories and frameworks. One is while we have those frameworks around us, we open our mind to data and let the data to speak out, and look for instances that might not necessarily go with the available categories. And that's where I discussed that you can develop some new categories, add to the available ones, with the purpose that ultimately modifying what is present. And as an example, for of course, these frameworks on motivation mostly come from quantitative research, but I can give you an example which is from qualitative. So initially, for example, Gardner and Lambert developed instrumental and integrative motivation. Then Desai and Ryan added to that category and said we can have intrinsic, extrinsic, and amotivation. And then Bonnie Norton, for example, used a more qualitative approach and said that these are more cognitively, psychologically oriented. There is a social aspect to motivation that she called investment. And she said that it highly relates to identity of language learners because she's working in that area, and therefore added new categories, new frameworks, new theories. So one strategy is that while we are using available categories, we also look for what does not fit, and we can create new categories and add to the current categorizations. The other strategy is that when I'm looking for intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, for example, to support my categories, I will intentionally looking for somebody who is not motivated. And so this is a negative case analysis. This is a deviant case analysis. Or somebody who might be motivated but does not use any of these terms and might have a totally different perspective on what it means to be motivated. So these are referred to as deviant cases or negative cases that we can work on and see how they can complement the data that we have from the majority of the cases.
In essence, your hope should be, rather than saying it fits or it doesn't, more like modifying, expanding the theory, what framework you use, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So it expands the scope of your theoretical explanation or hypothetical explanation of the phenomenon that you're studying. That's right. Yes, please.
So you mentioned about the report of the inter-rater reliability, because sometimes we need the intercoder, sometimes we don't. So my question is about the inter-rater reliability. Do we need to report about it in the qualitative research? Because sometimes when we do the code, I think that sometimes we can do like 2 times or 3 times with the coding. Sometimes we don't agree with ourselves. So
Yeah.
we need to report on the inter-rater reliability.
My attempt was to say that it is not one size fit all in qualitative research. In other words, it's not the case that any qualitative research requires intra and intercoded reliability, or at least not the exact terms that could be used. And as I indicated, it all depends on the purpose, on the research question, on the design of the qualitative research, and therefore we can find out in consultation with more experienced people and supervisors. However, some sort of intra and intercoded reliability is in operation all through the process, whether we explicitly state it or not. So I can say that there is intra and intercoded reliability involved in the process of qualitative research. Sometimes we directly and explicitly state it and do it and report it. Sometimes it is implicit. So the implicit is what I mentioned, that we need to document the process that we go through in order to develop our coding scheme and the way that it is changed over time. So all these reports actually is a report of intra-coded reliability. I suggested that we talk to other people and again document who we talked to, what was the results, what were the commonalities, differences, how we resolved the conflicts. Again, this is a report of intercoded reliability, but not necessarily written and worded under intra and intercoded reliability. In some more structured, perhaps we can say, qualitative research and analysis, people are intended to choose 10% of the data and code it today, leave it for 1 week, recode it the same 10%, and then calculate the correlation between the two turns of coding and see what percentage of consistency they have, and they do it with another person for intercoded reliability. So all depends on the context, on the design, on the questions, on the purpose, on the situation, and also your examiners and your readers, if we happen to know them, or if there is any indication of what sort of people will be reading our paper submitted to a journal or to. Yes, please.
Two things.
Yeah.
First, from the experience, can we combine both lumping and splitting approaches in one set of data? And the second question is, like in lumping, you said it's kind of thematic analysis, and I was a little bit confused because it seems to me like lumping is not detailed coding, but in thematic analysis, like you can also quote a document, a sentence, and then it sounds like detailed, very detailed. So.
Yeah, these categorizations are for the sake of better understanding the processes. In reality, you're right that they might not be that different, and it might be really difficult to differentiate among them. But the answer to your question is yes. I can say that it is possible to combine splitting and lumping together, because in a sense, as I mentioned, they are not that different. Again, when we look at that slide that we have basic teams and then organizing teams and global team. So this is not that different from splitting, because you can again think of these as codes, these as categories, and this as a team, right? The only difference is that code-based approach is more structured in a sense, and therefore can help more novice researchers to move step by step from code to subcategory, from subcategory to category, from categories to themes. Thematic analysis, some steps are done perhaps subconsciously, and usually could be done by more experienced researchers. So they ignore or they skip or jump some intermediary, steps, rather than coding, then subcategorizing and categorizing. They say, okay, I know it's this one, I know it's this one, I know it's this theme and topic, and then they bring those together.
It sounds to be like in thematic analysis, you can also apply the abductive approach as well. Right?
Sorry?
In thematic analysis,
Yes.
you can also, it sounds to me like you can also apply the
Code-based.
deductive, abductive approach.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, it is possible. I mean, both code-based and thematic analysis lend themselves to all three approaches: inductive, deductive, and abductive. Yeah. Yes.
Just going back to the first slide, so we talked about emic versus ethic
Yeah.
perspective. You mentioned that one of the features of quantitative research is that it's based on emic perspective as opposed to ethic, but we know that in qualitative research, it's actually based on interpretation, and then you mentioned the flexibility should be there. So actually, who's interpreting the data? It's the researcher, so it's ethic perspective present there. So it's both present, both ethic and emic. So how should we solve this? And should we mention that it's based on both ethic and emic? I'm a little bit confused actually.
Yes, that's another interesting question and comment, and a difficult one, because it's still a challenge to qualitative researchers. It is said that qualitative researchers are open-minded but not blank-minded, right? as qualitative researchers, we have read a lot, have developed some assumptions, and we are familiar with, most of the literature related to our topic. If you vividly bring those assumptions and prior experiences into research, then this is either deductive, so you are following deductive approach, or abductive, if you combine that with your data. So this is why I mentioned that we need to clarify the position of ourselves as researchers. Sometimes it might be the case that we are doing that, but we are pretending that we are not, and we are just, reporting what participants are saying. So this is why reflexivity is important, to clarify to our readers our position as researchers. The emphasis of Glaser on induction is that you really do not intervene in the process of research as the researcher with your assumptions and with the readings that you have done and with the frameworks that you are familiar with. And if there is any need to do that, only at the last stages, after you have already developed your data. So it requires a very conscious presence of you as researcher to put aside your assumptions, your theoretical frameworks, and just look at the data. And from this perspective, some researchers believe that classical grounded theory is objective, in a sense, because you just look at the data and anything comes from the data, and so no subjectivity, in a sense. Although these might be confusing at some levels, but again, to put in a nutshell, the answer to your question is that if we are able to clarify for ourselves and for the readers to what extent we are bringing in our assumptions and our prior readings and theories that we are familiar with, then it will help us and them to know where we are and where we are standing in regard to reporting a qualitative research. Yeah.
Because I was thinking that this ethic thinks if it's not present, then there is something wrong with qualitative.
Yeah. So we can say that the real emic perspective is classical grounded theory. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
My question is about the inductive approach. And from now on, I think, from my understanding, can we say that inductive is purely grounded theory because there are no traces of theoretical framework in inductive? However, for abductive and deductive, we have, again, traces of theory in our data analysis and results.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
that's right, and it's interesting that Mujgan actually did her thesis using grounded theory.
Yeah, exactly.
I was her associate supervisor, so maybe you can share your experience with the audience as what do you think in terms of these three approaches, inductive, deductive, abductive?
Yeah.
What do you think?
For me, now reflecting on what you mentioned here, mine was abductive.
Yeah.
Because I used my data, because my study was the first study of Persian heritage language learners in Sydney, and so I had no idea about these students, and no study has been done so far. So it was based on my data, so it was grounded theory and it was inductive in one way, but at the same time I used theoretical frameworks such as motivation by Desai and Bryan. I identity framework by Bonnie Norton. So I could see that it was exactly, yeah,
That's right,
the
yes.
abductive one.
So if you want to have another example of abductive approach to qualitative data analysis, then her thesis, PhD thesis, is another example as well. Yeah.
And one more thing, if you mentioned about those studies by Miles and Haberman and also by Paisley, like, can you introduce this one book as an introduction to qualitative research for like an MS student or someone who has just started PhD?
It would be really difficult because, as you noticed, any of us have a certain perspective
Yes.
when we are writing a book, and so again it depends on what approach we might be looking for, and therefore choosing one book and not the other one. I have provided a list of those people I have referred to, and hopefully I leave it to individual researchers to choose their own rather than introducing one particular.
Sorry, one more thing.
Yes.
We missed the first workshop as you
Yes.
mentioned by Phil Benson.
Yeah.
And we were lucky that just yesterday we received that email regarding your workshop. And is it possible to advertise it through faculty so everyone, at least in the faculty, can have access to those like workshops
To
in
the
future?
Oh, the future, sure, yeah, in the future, certainly, okay.
You know, because
But if you are interested to have the previous one as well, I can actually send that as well. Okay, sure. Okay, so yes, I will add. I have already created a group, so I would send both links. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.